Here.
Same here.
Whenever ready.
Mr. Speaker, we know that when we're talking about the Arab nations, they do not have a stable democracy. They're in the initial stage where they're adopting and in terms of adopting an application of the term of democracy, especially when we see the Arab Spring, which is in the status quo. People are fighting for the democracy. However, there is no stable infrastructure or consolidated value of democracy that has been adopted both by citizens and by the government in terms of implication and also in the adoption. So in this kind of stage, in this kind of context, we see the problem in the opening government and want to prove why secularism has some of the benefits, and especially in this particular context, it should be promoted. And secondly, why in this particular context, the harm will be great, and the harm should be stopped in this stage of adopting democracy for the Arab nations. So let's firstly look at how religion may have bad influence in the initial stage of democracy, how secularism has some benefits, although it is a controversial issue whether it's a best or perfect system. I have three analyses in terms of how characterizing secularism. Firstly, about how there could be a minority religion. Although we acknowledge the fact that they are Muslim-dominated countries, Muslim ideas in terms of religion, that there could be a minority religion that also needs to be respected, which is the very core idea of democracy, where minority also needs to be respected as well as majority. Secondly, about how secularism is better in the initial state, is that when there's a democratic value and religion value, and when people don't know where to turn on, and however, when the state and the religion is separated, people are likely to follow the democratic system, because the reason is thirdly because there is a rule, there is a judicial system, there is a checks and balance system within the democracy that's going to deter them from making decisions on the idea of religion that could be going against the democracy. So what the opening government think is that we should turn on to democracy in these kind of cases, and these kind of benefits is especially better in the context where they're in initial stage of adopting democracy. We're not saying that in U.S. because Obama is Christian and he values Christian values, that he should not come up as a president. However, we think that there should be a radical action which we define as ban, not letting any candidates to come up from the parties that has based their idea on the religion as a main candidate for president, that they should not be coming up as running for president. We have seen in Korea that when democratic ideas were accepted but was not completely consolidated or had a stable system of implication. Although we did have democratic idea and system in terms of president election and elected Park Chung-hee, we still cannot. It's still debatable whether he was dictator or the president or was actual president that represents democratic country. And this is the exact harm that I want to talk about later. The harm that could be brought, that brings to my second argument, how Arab nations, if you characterize them, they're Muslim-dominated countries where religion-based practice were taken right before the democratic ideas were lately accepted. So what they did was they literally translated Quran. It's really different from reading Bible and promoting Christian values within U.S. because they literally translated Quran. What the harms were brought was the extreme interpretations from the extremists that led to suffering of the minorities and also the rights of women for example, even in the extreme case leading to killing them or honor killings. These kind of terms were accepted in the name of religion. However, it's not anymore. We acknowledge that. However, we want to deter any kind of danger that could occur by making it remain and also making it have an opportunity to of a person who could hold this idea to be a representative of the country when there is an unstable democracy that has not been taken stable within the nation. Therefore, we think that this is very problematic of how when women's rights are suffered, like we have seen before, that it goes right against the idea of democracy. We think that democracy the idea of democracy, the values that it should uphold, and it does uphold when it's stable, goes right against the idea of the religion idea that we have just seen few decades ago. Yes, ma'am.
Just because you ban religious political parties doesn't mean these religious radicals will disappear off from society.
Of course not. That is why we need to take radical action in terms of taking initial action from banning them from becoming a leader. We cannot kill them. We cannot get rid of them, but we can deter them with this motion in this particular context, giving chance to even be a leader. And we think that it could also have an incentive for parties, because parties are created with their interest in terms of representation and gaining power. But if they cannot have a candidate that could represent them in order to be a leader, it could give them a strong incentive for them for decreasing the power of these parties that, as an opening government, want to strongly discourage. So about the values that democracies should uphold, we all know this: individual rights, participation, not only the majority but also the minority. We think that we think that these kind of values can all be really hard to be held by the religious idea. That's why we want to promote secularism in this particular kind of context. So as an opening government, we have given you the context of the debate of how there is already a problem. And as an initial stage in the process of through applying better democracy, or when the citizens, and especially when the citizens want it, and it's in the trend of how international society is also promoting it, this only deters the development in terms of democratization of these nations, but also opens up the loopholes in the system and opens up to the danger of extremist idea included within the presidential system, especially in the context of where there is unstable democracy. So in the end, we're very proud to propose of promoting democratic values, secular democratic values that has less danger, possibility of danger, and more chance of leading it to right kind of democracy that as an opening government want to promote in our nations. Thank you.
Alright, I thank the speaker for his speech, and to open case for CUDS 1, I call for illegal opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we fundamentally believe that today's debate is regarding the people and the opinions of the people. That's why as side opposition, we clearly believe that the ideas coming from the government side are absolutely just absurd. They come up here and say that just because you create a religious political party, that party is automatically going to lead to extremists trying to take over the country, dictators trying to dictate your own country. We believe that we are not living in that kind of state. We do believe that these kind of emerging democracies are still democracies, and they are still accountable by the people. Based on that, I'm going to do two things in today's speech. First of all, my first argument is going to talk to you about fundamentally on the principle basis upon why these parties are legitimate to begin with. And second of all, I'm going to talk to you especially on a political ground, why you have to bring it on the politics and you have to bring it out to open discussion that brings better development of that particular democracy. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal. First of all is regarding secularism. Second is regarding the dictatorship or whatever president that they want to talk about. And third of all, about the deterrence of development. First point of rebuttal regarding secularism. They came up here and said that secularism is a very fundamental good thing, but they never were able to contextualize and why it is particularly beneficial in a state such as an Arab country. But second of all, we also believe that it is very impractical to separate religion from these kinds of political grounds, because fundamentally, although you might be able to separate it upon a political ground, you can't separate every single individual living within that country, which is the fuel of every single democracy. Because individuals cannot break their religious within their politics. And if they think that abortion is a murder that goes against my individual values, then these individuals have a right to be represented at the end of the day. We believe that secularism is not something that can occur. Second point of rebuttal regarding stable state and all of this dictatorship. First of all, I have 3 responses. First of all, as our closing opposition and our opening is going to tell you, those kinds of extremists are still going to exist, Mr. Speaker. So fundamentally, you're not solving any kind of problem. You're actually making those extremists actually go to the deeper and the darkest of places within that Arab country, which doesn't necessarily bring any practicality. But second of all, we also believe that the characteristics of these individual newly emerging democracies are also going to think about the perceptions that the international society has. Mainly because these individual countries are based upon the help of other democratic nations, right? So obviously they're going to think about what kind of values are going to be implemented within a dictatorship, and these individuals obviously believe that they don't want to go for dictatorship. They're also going to be accountable for their actions. And third of all, we also believe that people are rational enough not to agree to like a bombing idea of trying to bomb 9/11 and the World Trade Center. Because fundamentally, we see it in a clear case example of Egypt right now. Although it is a Muslim-dominated state, the president was actually doing fundamental, like very secret pacts within all of these other countries. And because they were about to create a law that actually gets into dictatorship, the people were actually protesting against that Egyptian president. Checks and balances already exist within the status quo. That is just fundamentally not going to occur. Third point of rebuttal regarding deterrence of development. We don't understand why a political religious leader is going to deter the development of that country, when first of all, they're fundamentally accountable by the people. But second of all, we also believe that it's not necessarily, obviously, as I've already said, it's going to accommodate the majority of the people, and the people have to agree that we are going to bomb 9/11, or we're going to prevent that deterrence to begin with. But second of all, we also believe that in the clear case of Afghanistan, even if a political leader was actually trying to bomb, the majority of Afghanistan people don't necessarily agree to bombing another individual country. Checks and balances already exist. We believe that that case is fundamentally flawed. First point is regarding why those parties are legitimate on a principle ground, and I have 3 reasons why. First of all, because we fundamentally believe that these are democracies. These are accountable by the people, and the people want that party to begin with, right? Because democracy is all about engaging within the opinions of the people, and if Arab states and the majority of people are actually Arabic and Muslim, and they want their representation and their religious views to be implemented within politics, we believe that that kind of representation should actually be legitimized. But second of all, we don't necessarily think that it is the criteria upon when we actually ban a particular party, right? Because the only criteria in when we prevent parties from entering into politics, and when that particular, I'll take you in a moment, when that party is actually actively seeking out to harm individuals, such as the example of far-right, extremist-right parties. Those are the only indications in which we can actually ban a particular party. But even in those instances, those are cases that are very, very up to debate, and that are very up to discussion. And only in the democratic grounds, and only in the political grounds, those kinds of discussions can actually occur. Therefore, we believe that legitimacy actually increases. I'll take you in a minute. And my third reason upon why it can actually be legitimized is because fundamentally, we don't necessarily think that the government has a right to decide which kind of political value or which kind of religious background you actually are based upon. Because the main core idea regarding religious opinions and religious ideas is that it is based upon your environment, the kind of ideas that you were born upon. And if you were born into a particular religion, and if religion is your life, and that decides upon what kind of actions you take in the future, we don't necessarily think that it is the government's best idea to prevent these kinds of political parties from emerging, because fundamentally we believe that those are the opinions of the people, and you cannot dictate those kinds of ideas, and that's why these parties are legitimate to begin with. Before I go on, any points? Yes, closing.
According to your logic, you're talking about how far-right parties are ruled out of the status quo because they're extremists. But according to your logic, they're going to exist anyway, so what is your answer to that question?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that it should be actually debated upon the political grounds, and it should be open to open discussion. And that's basically what I've been talking about for the past 5 minutes, right? Obviously, adjudicators, you know what I've been talking about. So let's go into my second idea regarding why it should be particularly politics. And I have 2 reasons why. First of all, because fundamentally the idea of any democratic nation is to talk about more discourse. It is about to talk about more discussion. And the reason why checks and balances exist within a political sphere is because it is accountable to every single individual living within that country. Everyone is going to actually see what kind of politics, what kind of values, what kind of religious ideas are based upon that policies and based upon that party. And because it is accountable by the people, and if it does not get approval by the people living in that society, we believe that that kind of discourse is actually a fundamental thing. Because the people are able to critique those ideas, the people actually have the capacity to critique and make make sure that that individual party actually creates better ideas and better politics. It is their burden to prove why people are going to be stupid enough to actually agree with the policy that's going to bomb 9/11 or the World Trade Center. We believe that substantial harm does not exist upon their model. But second of all, they want to talk about minority religion, so let's engage upon that, which is the second reason. Because fundamentally, we do agree to the fact that minority religions do exist within these Muslim countries, but we believe that the political ground is the best way to represent your idea, to represent your fundamental opinion. Why is that? Because only in the political sphere do you have legitimacy, you have a mandate to actually give out your opinion to begin with. So fundamentally, that's also beneficial. But second of all, it is the best place in which you can expose your ideas, because obviously there's going to be media coverage. Obviously there's going to be a lot of people interested in that minority religion, which is the best place to actually, not necessarily propagate, but actually show your opinion to the entire country. And that's why it's a fundamental benefit. But under their model, if you ban these political parties to actually come out into the open, you are pushing these minority religions into the deepest and the darkest corners, which actually discriminates them and makes them into a fundamentally harmful state. We believe that representation will not occur under that model, which is the best reason why we actually oppose today's motion.
Right, I thank the Speaker for his fine speech, and to continue the case for HYDS1, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of Opposition's speech was really good. It's just that it would have been really good in the context of a well-stabilized, liberal, democratic country. Initially, initially democratizing Arab nations, their whole case about how minorities' religion should be respected and how there would be checks and balances, how people would fear what other people think. That doesn't stand in this context, Mr. Speaker. That only applies in a well-stabilized liberal democracy, like in a debate where the United States should officially allow Christian groups or Muslims groups to participate in elections. That is the context where they're debating. Please engage with us, the second speaker. Now, before moving on to the two things that I mainly want to talk about, the first is how the religious parties are very different from religious individuals. And on my second point of the judicial system, let me just first rebut to what the previous speaker has said. Okay, so what the previous speaker is saying is that, in the initial stage of democracy, people are still accountable and that we should trust these people. But the thing is, Mr. Speaker, even in well-stabilized democracies, like even in Germany, there still are discourse of whether allowing these Christian groups, this Christian political party to actually participate in elections and whatnot. This is the context that we're still debating on. Even in liberal democratic countries, there still is discourse and there still is controversy about allowing religious groups to actually participate in this. And that is why, especially in this initially stable initial democracies, those kind of Arab nations, it is most important to not allow these religious groups and ban them from actually coming into elections and harming that countries to further democratize and to further consolidate their democracies, Mr. Speaker. And for their second point, for their arguments about how secularism should be beneficial and that it's impractical to separate religion and your life. Of course it is. I'm a devoted Christian. I can't really separate who I am when I'm working. But the thing is, as I will explain in my arguments, there's a difference between coming up as a religious party and me just being a religious person, right? So in this case, we think that is very different. And what we fear is an official movement, an official action that's been taken by these religious groups in participating in democracy, Mr. Speaker. My third point of rebuttal is how they say extremists will still exist. That was a POI, right? But we think this whole argument, but they will still exist. This is a strong enough argument to say that we should not ban. Because, of course, in any kind of cases, there will still be people who exist. There will still be extremists. There will still be extreme rightists and whatnot. But still, this is not the reason to say that we should not ban. This is more of a reason that we should actually ban, so we can deter these people from coming into power, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so for their first rebuttal to their first argument of how people want that party, what we question is their whole premise that actually people want that party, Mr. Speaker. Because considering this as an Arab nation where they're now starting to have elections, where they're now understanding this notion of picking their own representatives, picking their own leaders, we think there could be many ways of abuse, many ways of manipulation done by the governments and done by the people who are in power, Mr. Speaker, through the manipulation of media or through the manipulation of ballots or whatnot. There can be many ways that these groups can actually manipulate the votes and manipulate the process of democracy. And in this case, we question their idea of how people actually want that party, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so for to move on to my to move on to the two substantives that I have is, first of all, differentiating the religious parties and religious individuals, Mr. Speaker. I think it's pretty clear that once a religious party comes into election, then that party in itself has an identity, has a clear goal, has a clear incentive, or has a clear intention. That is some related to religion, right? They're not pure parties that actually hold certain political views about conservative or about liberals. They have this idea of religion incorporated in their goals and in their agendas that they want to pursue, Mr. Speaker. And in this case, we think it is wrong for democracies, especially when they're initial democracies, for this idea to actually happen. And in the case of how they keep on saying, in the Muslim countries, there are religious people, whatnot. We have told you in our PM speech that it is very different to have an individual who's a religious person and that person or any person coming as under the name of religious group, Mr. Speaker. That is why we don't ban Obama, we don't ban Romney, we don't ban Nixon, whatever, those kind of religious presidents from coming into elections. It's just that we ban them once they form a religious group and have a clear agenda of pursuing their own religions or actually influencing some sort of democracy in their country, Mr. Speaker. I want to move on to the second point about this judicial system, Mr. Speaker. What we have to understand is in a democracy that is initially stabilizing, or in a country that is adopting democracy, what also happens is making of law, Mr. Speaker, the making of judicial system. Making of a judicial system. So what the government has to do is, with their cabinet members or with the parliament, they make law, they initiate law, and they try to apply that law, Mr. Speaker. And in the case where now, in Egypt, where they don't have a real constitution right now, especially in this kind of cases where they were trying to make the constitution, trying to make their articles, trying to make the laws of their country, we don't think any of the religious ideas or those values should in any way influence the making, influence in any way of the judicial system, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because when it is a Muslim religion, when it's Islamic idea, it's Islamic views, how they undervalue women, how they literally interpret Quran. We think there's a fear, and we fear that the influence of those Islamic religions Muslim views influencing Quran.
Okay, if you can see that people cannot actually separate their religious values from their real life, how are those individual lawmakers going to differentiate their religious values from laws?
Mr. Speaker, in a democracy, it is not one person who makes law, Mr. Speaker. There are so many different types of people and so many different groups who actually make law. As I have said, governments and cabinet members and parliaments and the lawyers and judges, whatnot, they all come together and they make law. What we fear is having a religious party that dominates the government, the religious party that was elected by the people through manipulation or whatnot. Those people coming to power and those people making law, which will be very difficult to go back once that law is set, Mr. Speaker. That is why we see in the US, when the Constitution is made, it's very difficult to actually amend that Constitution. It is very difficult to go back and change the laws, Mr. Speaker, because that was what was initially said when US was democratized in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And that is why what we fear is religious groups, especially these Muslim groups, with their ideas, with their values of valuing humans, undervaluing women's rights, and undervaluing women's equal rights and equal freedom to every single individual person. We fear that, and also on top of that, what we fear also is minority groups, minority religions, having being suppressed or oppressed even more with this dominant majority religious groups being elected in the first place. So for them, not just dominant religious groups, but now the judicial system backs those majority religious groups and suppresses those minority religions. Very proud to propose.
Right. I thank the speaker for a fine speech, and to continue the case of open opposition, I call upon the deputy.
Mr. Speaker, I'll divide my rebuttals into two parts. Firstly, the part that actually is contentious, and secondly, the part that doesn't actually sound logically valid in the first hand. There's a logical read that can't be appreciated by a conscious, educated individual. I'll tell you why. Like, in the first part, they actually talked about how these people can actually manipulate elections. Well, 2 points of responses. Firstly, in that case, even non-religious people would not actually do this and would not actually be able to have a healthier democracy if you can stuff the ballot boxes with something that you don't want, and if you can actually rig elections. There's actually no potential possibility of these democracies from even being established in the first place. And there's this potential distinction between the types of parties you want and the types of democracies on how strong that democracy is. If it's not ready, there shouldn't be a democracy at all. And that's the stance of our side. And secondly, there is a lot of influence from Silvio Berlusconi in terms of Italian politics, and has a lot of influence, but that doesn't mean that the state has a right to actually restrict this individual from coming out as a political member of a political party. Just because you have a lot of influence on something that you call a democracy, it doesn't mean you should do it. And the third and the second part about how these parties are worse off than individuals, since like there is an official symbol of this matter. Well, firstly, symbolic manifestations of religion actually exist in the Vatican, exist in the mosque, and they often express political opinions throughout in the public, which often has a lot of media coverage if you are a majority religion. I don't think there was a distinction between the political parties and from these giant organizations and institutionalized religious capacities that actually don't get media exposure, and we need a lot of distinction in this case. And there was also this idea of like Muslim domination in the first speaker. 2 points of responses. Firstly, banning religious parties does not actually ban these policies from being engendered. You explicitly conceded to our case, saying you can't actually dissociate religion from your political ideologies since they are newly emerging democracies. In that case, if the society is so biased towards women due to religion, these policies will be engendered no matter what. And the religious political parties isn't the issue in today's debate. And on the second level, diminished religious parties actually means that you diminish minority religious from actually going out in the public. What is the problem that arises from them? Oftentimes these Arabic countries are comprised of many different spheres of religion and many different spectrums of religion that often don't have a voice out in the public. And if you don't allow these people to actually come out, where you actually can't separate religion from politics, these minorities actually suffer due to a consequence, since you actually don't let them out in the open for a public discussion. There's nothing on our side that does better than that. And there's also this notion about like secularism being better. Well, you could not actually prove that people can dissociate religion from politics in such religious areas. And these people are going to cluster together and express their public opinions. And if there are a lot of people that actually express a certain thought, there is going to be politicians that want votes from these groups of people and will engender policies that are actually going for these individuals in the first hand. And this notion regarding judicial system issue is logically invalid, Mr. Speaker. Well, first off, there was a Western influence from like these established democracies, so they will have to actually look out for such influence when they actually engender the system. And if you rig the constitutions to the extent that you actively oppress certain minorities, they will not allow these instances from occurring. And secondly, if lawmakers are also people, and if they can't dissociate religion from public spheres, then these lawmakers are obviously going to engender constitutions under your logic, the ones that actually get biased towards these people. And the only distinction that they gave was like there are a lot of people that that make laws. Well, good. Then you have a lot of people that suck. Then you have a lot of people that actually can't differentiate from these matters. I don't think the number of people actually matters in today's debate. Mr. Speaker. Like you have a number of stupid people making the laws under your case, and you don't you're not helping your case in any way. I'm going to present to you a new constructive material, Mr. Speaker, with regards to why overly religiously biased policies would not occur even in these initial democracies because of the natural checks and balances that exist in these characteristics.
When religious idea is prominent and consolidated in that country, have you ever overcome and evolved to be a more stable democracy?
That was your characterization. The idea that you can't actually dissociate religion from political sphere. That's the burden that you had to prove, in the promise that you have to engender by these religious policies and religious parties engendering these policies. And I don't think that is our burden. A new characterization from me with regards to why overly religious biased policies would not occur in these countries. This will be divided into two parts. Well, firstly, I'm going to talk about why there are a wide array of religions, and these religious parties that get elected can't actually ignore the minority religions in the first hand. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why there are a wide spectrum of believers as well, and why those radicalized people would not actually be the ones influencing the policies that are being engendered in these areas. Well, firstly, with regards to why there are a lot of religions in the first place. Well, it is a majority rule, obviously. There is going to be limited seats in the parliament, and there is going to be a lot of influence from atheists, from other religious minorities, and other people that actually take the seats in the parliament. Well, obviously, if you have 65% Muslims, 20% Hindus, and 10% Christians and 5% atheists, these people will comprise the populations if they don't like these religious parties to take the seats in the parliament. And these minority influence cannot be ignored, since they have an initial stage of democracy, and they have gone through a political turmoil in the first hand. And these turmoil is likely to occur if you don't actually allow these people to actually come forward to give their opinions in the parliament in the first hand. Therefore, these lawmakers would not actually engender policies based upon the ignorance of these minority parties. And second part, with regards to wide spectrum of believers. Well, if you look at the types of believers, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there are these people, these radical believers that only care about giving your life to Allah or whatnot. There are moderate believers that care about the stability of the society. And if you actually concede that these people exist, the portion of radical and most moderate people would actually want social stability over religious ideals. And just they have just gone through the political turmoil of destroying that stability, and they want a stable nation of a stable democracy. And they would not actually want radical policies that actually cause an uprising from these minority religions in the first hand. And these moderate believers that believe in the majority religions will not actually want these lawmakers to engender policies based upon the radical thoughts, since it is likely to lead to a political turmoil that's likely to dismantle this democracy that they have established. And if this is true, leaders would not want what people would not want, and will not have the policies that overly bias their religions in the first hand. And because of these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose.
Right, I thank the Speaker for his speech, and to extend the case for Iwa, I call upon the Member of Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, in my speech and the closing government, we're going to go back to principles, why the principle of democracy should not be associated with the idea of a religion, especially in the context of newly democratized nations, why this leads to further harms in the international society, why it discourages other democratization in other states that is currently going on. But further on, I'm going to basically be talking about, the principles of democracy as a whole. Now, what opening government did not really do was, associating again concept of democracy, how it fails in this context, right? But we're also going to extend on the international relations and how this affects other nations as a whole, how it actually how it intensifies the conflict that is going on in the Middle East. But before going on to our contribution, several steps have involved regarding their case. Now they first come up and talk about, how these radical people that the opening government was talking about is going to exist anyway. Therefore, we give them room to debate upon, in a political sphere. But first of all, even in the status quo, we do not give them power, right? If they have these kinds of radical stances, instead of giving them power, we regulate them with law, we regulate them with secularism, where we have we went to treat these individuals who are getting harmed equally. so we rule that out. That is exactly why they were talking about, how these far right-wing parties also being ruled out from the very society. But Simonappa also comes up and talks about how, there will be a lot of turmoil if this is not brought into the political sphere in the very first place. But we clearly suggest to the Harms that, there will be more turmoil, there will be more internal conflicts when this policy is not initiated, right? Because we actually think that the individuals within these nations like Egypt or Syria who initiated changes are not necessarily the religious individuals, right? We actually think that the biggest group who actually initiated these changes are actually liberalists who are influenced by the democratic values in these very nations. And these individuals do not agree with some of the religious values that these kinds of big political parties such as Muslim Brotherhood suggest. So we also think that in that kind of a context, Mr. Speaker, these kinds of individuals who do not agree with these kinds of religious parties, they are going to cause turmoil again. Therefore, we think that in that kind of a case, turmoil never disappears under their policy at the same time. Going on to the third level of response regarding Taewopa's biggest idea of how religion, especially in this kind of context, has to be debated upon a political sphere. Why we actually defend minority religions. Three steps of responses regarding that. First, we think that usually in this country there is like a dominant religion called a Muslim, even whether they are like Shia or these kind of religions. We think that parties like Muslim Brotherhood or Salafists, we actually think that these kind of a single religious party overrules other minority parties. So we think that in this kind of a case, the concept of accountability that they are talking about, we think that this does not happen in this kind of political sphere from the very beginning. But we also think that minority religious parties cannot be established from very beginning, Mr. Speaker, because in order for a political party to form and gain seats in the parliament from the very first place, you need support from the people. But because the majority of people in the nation do not stand for these kinds of minority religions, we think that there will be a power imbalance going on in this parliament, which we do not want to achieve in today's society, Mr. Speaker. Moving to the third level, because we think the characteristic of religion itself is very exclusive because you only believe in one God and you rule out all of the other principles designed by, other religions or other values. We actually think that this kind of single religious parties, dominant religious parties, cannot be, these kinds of policies or concepts cannot be applied to everybody, which democratic nations should be going for. Before I go on to my extensions, any points of information? I'll take you over.
Okay, so basically your idea of a minority religion is that because they are unable to voice out their opinion as effectively as other Muslim states, we should just shut them up and allow them to get discriminated in society.
Right? We think under their policy, they're going to be under the power, they will never voice out under their policy. That's why we want to promote the most equal value called secularism in the political sphere from the very first place so they can compete for seats, compete within their policies. Now I'm going to tell you the concept of democracy failing in this context. I have three-step analysis: accountability, ability to check itself and improve its values and actually foster a debate within democracy. And I'm going to talk about protecting its citizens' rights, right? So what is so special about these kinds of religions? We think that firstly, their values are very fixated. In the Quran, but values are hardly changing because your God is the only one. You have the set rules of dogma, for example, 10 rules in Christians, or you have the rules in Muslims, right? And secondly, we also think that these kinds of religions are very exclusive to themselves, which means that if you believe in a certain religion, you will love all the other religions. You believe only in your God and only in your dogma. Therefore, your policies are going to be something that only goes towards your own interest and your own values, which should not be promoted in a democratic society. On the third level, we see cases in Sharia laws where you actually stone women, where you actually limit some of the rights of other groups. We think that these kinds of radical laws, suggested by these Muslim groups, should never be promoted. So what happens to accountability, right? We think that in order to project a policy, you need a check and balance system within you, between the parties and citizens. But we think that when you have a religious value, which is more like a truism to citizens who believe in you, usually your reasoning for your policy should be becomes a top-down process, right? Because you think they're going to tell the citizens, this is what your God wants, this is what you do. In this kind of a case, it becomes more of a truism than a check and balance for citizens. In this kind of a case, the principle of democracy falls. But not just that, right? We actually think that the organic changes that can go on in these nations, it's going to be hard. Why? Because citizens are not held accountable, they rather just listen to the government and the religious party because they're using the principles that is your identity, that is your God, right? So therefore, the citizens not actually gain legitimacy or reasoning or power to go against your government because then you're going against your God. But if you're believing in a certain religion, so we think that the concept of accountability does not happen under your model. But second, we also think that regarding the ability to check, no thank you, sit down. Ability to check itself and debate upon, we think that there is also going to be harm. Why? usually what democracy does is it respects diversity of values, right? Like for example, position of women, race, or even transgender or gay rights, they are debated upon. That's how a certain social norm value evolves in the society. But this kind of debate is likely to be harmed within the religious party. Why? Because we again tell you that religion, like value itself, is very fixed, that you're supposed to follow it. Therefore, discussion itself is blocked from the very beginning under your society. Therefore, we do not want these things going on in the society from the very beginning. Going on to the next extension, right, regarding international relations, we actually think that this will discourage other liberalists and other countries from newly democratizing in nations such as Syria, right? We think that, again, we told you that liberalists are the biggest group which initiates change in newly democratizing nations towards a direction where it fosters equality. In these kinds of nations, if we actually see that if these liberalists in Egypt or in other countries are discouraged, we actually think that these kinds of liberalists who are trying to initiate changes in other countries are also going to discourage. We think this is a clear harm that we see in the status quo when we want to promote principles of democracy. In this kind of case, Mr. Speaker, we think that because we need to promote better values within international sphere, and because the principle of democracy falls, we take the debate. Thank you.
Right, I thank the speaker for her fine speech, and for the last substantive speech of this debate, I call upon the member of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, as a debater, you're not supposed to have expectations of a debate. Like, you go what your opening set out to do. We thought this debate was ultimately going to be the government proving to us why radical parties are more likely to exist, and hence why these populations of emerging democracies were more susceptible to the manipulations of radical parties. Unfortunately, none of that analysis came from all three speakers of the government bench. So it came down to me, as the member of opposition, by the way, to contextualize what this debate is truly about, and why, ultimately, at the end of the day, we think the existence of political parties will achieve true democracy, and a healthy one at that, in these states. And before I do that, let's go into the rebuttals of Unji's speech. Unji tells us multiple things. Now, she tells us, look, movements were initiated by liberals, they don't agree with religion, and hence, when you have religious parties existing, it'll cause turmoil. Number one, if they are liberals that don't abide by religious, parties or dogma, they won't vote for the religious parties to begin with. But secondly, we tell you that because there's different radicalism, radicalists, liberalists, and whatever, it'll actually lead to a discourse of different political values and systems to be established. So we don't see a problem, especially if the liberals are the dominant in power, especially if the liberals that are the ones that want change, we don't see a problem of having political parties of religious basis to begin with. Then they tell us, look, values are fixated. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, when you're talking about religion. We're talking about religious parties. Please prove to us, Taeyong, why a religious party automatically leads to automatic stoning of women in the parliament, or automatic, killing of the gays. We tell you, none of them ever prove to us that a religious party automatically leads to respecting the exact phrases of the Quran. We tell you, on the other hand, the Quran tells you to respect your neighbors, love them, and share bread. So if the government's going to be a welfare state, giving bread to the unfortunate, are you going to be against that as well? We tell you that they're the ones who are actually biased towards the idea of Muslims. And thank God none of you are Muslims on the table, because that was a very offensive stance coming from the government men. So automatically, a Muslim party will be a radicalist that stones all women, all gays, anybody wearing pink. Now, we tell you that, and then furthermore, she tells us this brand labeling, right? It'll harm international relations. Why and how? I think Kylie will explain. Because she tells us that somehow we need to instill better values. What exactly are these better values? Are better values, following what Obama does, are better values just doing whatever the liberal democracies in the West do? Because we ultimately tell you, Arab Spring was a significant event because it was a Muslim democracy to be established. It was a Middle Eastern value that they want to establish as their own country. We have no problem with that whatsoever. Sit down. Now, we're going to talk to you about my extensions, right? Which are primarily going to be, look, at the end of the day, current status quo with religious parties will lead to a more participatory democracy. That ultimately two things will happen in the status quo if we were to watch and see and wait. Number one, we think more trust will happen on the stance of the population to the politics and the system itself. And secondly, we think that more participation on that hand will happen due to the trust. Why is this so? We think the context of this debate ultimately is talking about states that are dominantly Muslim, where number one, minorities exist, but number two, radicalists also exist, right? We tell you that this is ever more important because we see a status quo where the populace itself wanted a change and achieved change, but in which direction they're going to go, they're still haunted by the dogmas of the past. They're still haunted by the movements that they want to make. So we still have like imams or religious leaders manipulating small minorities and communities in which direction they should go to. And then we have these liberal young generation that want a full-blown democracy. That's the context that we want to talk about, and that's the context in which this party exists. Furthermore, we're talking about weak democracies at that, right? Our opening already clearly told you why a check and balance exists, because ultimately, because so many radicals and liberals exist, that naturally turns into what citizens want. But furthermore, we want to tell you that the democracies that exist right now in these states have weak foundations, and this is where our unique contribution is going to be. We say weak foundations on two levels. Number one, trust. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody really understands what democracy is to begin with. So there's a lack of trust in the next leader and which direction he or she will take. Secondly, we say that there's a scattered citizens depending on their political views and religious views. And the only way that we're actually going to allow that to fix itself within the system itself is by allowing religious parties to exist. How is this so? We tell you that trust doesn't exist because we now have underground influence of religious leaders and communities of minorities and radicalists, right? But rather, hold on, when you make them come up to the surface, right? When you actually form them in the form of political parties, they have to abide by the political parties. They can't stuff ballot boxes. They can't radicalize and kill off the opposition party because now they have to play by the rules of democracy, not by religious radicalism. But yes, Lisa, what do you have to say about that?
Considering the unique context that we were debating on, especially about Arab countries, what we want to deter those extremist parties, those worst case scenarios to actually happen that would then determine the future of that Arabic country, whether it would be a healthy democracy or not.
They're making this debate really simplistic, right? We don't want to see prostitutes, we don't want to see drugs, so let's just ban it and completely hide it on the underground. We tell you that when we're talking about religious influences, right? Just because you eliminate the party doesn't mean these radicals eliminate themselves. Rather, it means that these radicals go underground and influence on a more subtle level where they believe, look, don't trust democracy, religion's the way to go. Because we're talking about so-called religious population, in order for a healthy discourse to happen, in order for people to understand how religion and politics and agendas can play out in partnership, you need to put it on a political platform, on a democratic platform, where a healthy discourse can happen, not, priests and Muslim groups, having prayer about what is right or what is wrong. We tell you that when you put it in a political atmosphere, what is wrong and what is wrong is not based on only the Quran. It's based on which direction your society and your community will walk into. So for them to say that, look, this policy solves radicalism, simply doesn't work because as they admit, radicalists still exist in that society. The majority population is still religious. So what do we do about that? We put them and we mold them into political voices. We mold them into political agendas, and that's how you achieve democracy. But furthermore, when we're talking about, scattered people, we tell you that at the end of the day, the reason that people are swept away by certain movements, especially when we're talking about emerging democracies, because they have nothing to rely on but the identity of themselves, right? We tell you that that's why radicalism perhaps flourishes in states that are not democratic. We tell you that when you logically understand the situation in terms of, look, number one case scenario, people want radical views. People think women are trash. People think, gays should all die. In that case, unfortunately so, we think if that is the 100% majority of the nation and that's the direction that they wish to go, because after logical political calculus, they will do so, unfortunately, we're fine with that, because democracy, unfortunately, represents the majority of the people. But we tell you, under your context, that's not what's going to happen in the Middle East, because it's the liberals, it's a young generation that wants a new direction for their people. So we tell you, those radical parties, number one, will not be created in the first place, but number two, will not even be supported. So what kind of world and worries do you create under your analysis? Because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that we are achieving a democracy, we are voting, we are seeing political discourse happening. So under that framework, isn't it better to include the radicals, include the neutrals, include the liberals, and let them fight it out on the political platform, rather than, in order for them to disappear off the space of the map, we're just going to let them not be politicians. We simply don't see a solution, we simply don't see an analysis why radicalism will be the only scenario, because we see under our system, anything goes, and under a political mold, that's when a true democracy will be established. For those reasons, we're very proud to close.
And to conclude the case for the government bench as a whole, I call upon the government.
Speaker, in liberal democracy, we never believe that representation equals to democracy. Mr. Speaker, in liberal democracy, we believe that healthy discourse, as Heoni has mentioned, and different ideas coexisting and different values upholding and coexisting in today's society is the meaning of democracy, and it's what we want to achieve without the regulations of the religion sector in today's society. Before I go on to any of my class here, let me rebut to some of the cases from Heoni's side. First of all, she talks about we have to prove, well, I have to prove how religious party actually leads to stoning of women. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of impossible how we can actually relate it in logical links, how it will directly link religious party into stoning women. However, Mr. Speaker, religion is a basic belief of individuals, the source of where the logical thinking comes from, and their beliefs are based on, Mr. Speaker. So, for example, when a problem exists, for example, women's empowerment and women actually getting not respected in today's society, the policies to actually tolerate this problem itself is calculated upon the basis of the religious sector, for example, the religious ideas and calculations. For example, as Catholic nations, with the parties with Catholic notion to themselves, Mr. Speaker, when they actually tolerate these problems in today's society, for example, contraception as example, they imply the religious sector in tolerating the people who want to get the contraception, preventing it because the religious values actually override, actually implement in the policy-making process at the end of the day. Therefore, their problems are never fixed and they're never tolerating and actually preventing the stoning of the woman in general and in today's sense. Secondly, you want to talk about the weak foundation, which was a unique extension coming from the opposition side, right? So, Mr. Speaker, Heoni has conceded to the fact that there's underground influences, actually radical actions actually taking place, stuffing up the boxes, election not being fair, etc., etc. Mr. Speaker, we want to think in a logical sense, right? When these individuals or radical religious parties, who are the majority of the people in Arab Spring, for example, Muslims, etc., when they actually grab power, do you think they will just follow the rules of democracy? They will suddenly not stuff the boxes and they will suddenly change it into this angelic democratic westernizations? No, Mr. Speaker, we believe that when they actually grab the power and actually they have the power of the political parties, the majority of the political parties in that sense, we can look at from the history, Mr. Speaker, that these individuals will never follow the democratic rules and mold them into the political agendas according to the religious sectors and religious beliefs at the end of the day. Before I go on, API.
Okay, why do you think that all of the single characterizations that is going to come up to the political sphere are always going to be extreme rights, are always going to be extreme religious people?
We believe that, as I told you before with the Catholic example, Mrs. Stewart, we believe that every implication that these government makes, even though it may be not all based on the religious sector, it will be impeded upon their own ideas, their own agenda setting, calculations, and mechanism. No, thank you. Mr. Speaker, going on to clashes, how we will never achieve democracy at the end of the day with their policies coming from both opposition and opposing. Mr. Speaker, as I told you before, we believe that democracy stands on the pillars of coexisting of ideas and actually the check and balance system that does not happen naturally under the religious ideas. Mr. Speaker, opposing opposition came here. No, thank you. Opposing opposition came here and told us that democracy is very accountable, the religious democracy is very accountable when religious parties take place because, it's accountable for everyone and religion is very hoped by people and it's the core values of these individuals. Exactly how democracy will never take place. Mr. Speaker, we believe that representation of the majority, which is obviously the majority of the Arab Spring, Arab nations in that sense, these individuals will never achieve accountability as religions are taking as the government's agenda, Mr. Speaker. First of all, we believe that different ideas are needed to be coexist in today's society, and they actually have to compete, and every idea has a check and balance system by the nation itself. No, thank you. Whether it's through public discourse or whether it's challenged, Mr. Speaker, we believe that after this discourse and after this competition, the social norms are actually formed, the majority still votes for it or not, are actually left to the people themselves. So therefore, we believe that every problem that arises in today's society, the society checks itself with the check and balance system in process of checking this idea, whether ruling it out or ruling it in and imposing this idea to the government themselves. So Mr. Speaker, we believe that this perception change over time, this tradition traditional ideas change over time by opting in and opting out by the rules of individuals, and ruling the discrimination, for example, throughout the countries, throughout time courses, etc., Mr. Speaker. So we really, the ability to change idea is the core fundamental idea of democracy. So let's look at the check and balance system that the opposition kept coming out with by saying that it's totally fine. Mr. Speaker, we believe the natural check and balance system never exists under religious sectors, and they will never achieve democracy at the end of the day. Why is it so? Mr. Speaker, religious ideas never change over time. As we have experienced, no, thank you, you're on another round. Religious ruling patterns, religious ideas are never changing over time. Nonetheless, are they not only exclusive, Mr. Speaker, but these religious values are coming from the history, for example, from Quran or Bible and other religious information, Mr. Speaker, and these values are never changed because they are set to the government and the values at the core of the people, which are very accountable according to the opening opposition, right? So when this idea of traditional values are very set, and these policies are made upon these ideas of traditional values set to these individuals, then when we actually look at the problems like women being inferior to men, problems like women actually being discriminated because of the value of this idea coming from themselves, we believe that these ideas and policies based on these traditional values themselves are always never going to be changed under their case. So they will always be embedded as a source of belief of these individuals, and it will be reflected on calculating whether what is wrong or right. So what is happening? Because of this public discourse is never being achieved, because the natural idea of the traditional value is never changing at the end of the day. So those NEAO who actually want to challenge this idea actually want to bring the discourse by saying that this problem is wrong, therefore we should have a democratic value by having this public discourse, will never be achieved at the end of the day, because the idea is so accountable. Those who try to challenge it at the end of the day will be called as anti-government. Those will be called the rebels, because the idea is so accountable and so set to the value at the end of the day. Therefore, their system of natural check and balance system will never work, and actually democracy is never achieved from the religious values or policies coming from natural values. Mr. Speaker, we believe that when these different values are coexisting in today's society, and when you give up power to monopolizing this one specific idea of religious values, the traditional values are never changing. Therefore, we believe that the grandizing progressive organic change to actually make the changes for these individuals will never be achieved at the end of the day, and will never be succeed under your case and your case. Thank you.
Right, and to conclude the opposition's case and this debate as a whole, I call upon the opposition, please.
You engage in both sides, the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. If religion does have a tendency to create radical policies, which they never proved, we tell you, okay, we will engage to that scenario. But moreover, you need to also engage to our policies, our model of the positive connotations, the positive effect of the religion that's heavily religious biased in these societies. We tell you that they failed to tell us, not only they failed to prove to us the logical link between religious groups and the religiously radical, religiously, in a way, biased or religiously extreme policies, but moreover they failed to engage to our policy as a whole in the opposition bench. So on that idea, I'd like to divide the debate into two parts. Firstly, the clash of how religious party so wrong, or does it have any kind of justifiable harm? Secondly, what are the consequences of blocking religion completely out from the societies that are heavily religion biased? Let's move on to our first clash. Are religious parties wrong in itself? Now, we heard from the characterization of opening government that Muslim religion itself is bad. The Muslim religion itself is against the principles of democracy, which uphold freedom, which uphold rights. We asked you constantly, Mr. Speaker, that if these ideas, if these religious values are irreconcilable with the principles of democracy, how under your model would you ever instill democracy into societies where religion is heavily influencing? We tell you that doesn't really work. Why? Number one, because these religions are heavily up to interpretation. Hence, for you to nitpick on the most Methodist, most extreme, most principled interpretation of religion simply doesn't justify the complete shutting out of religion from the politics in itself. So, secondly, we tell you that there are proof, sit down, there are proof where revolutions did in fact happen in reality, where there are proof that these people, the citizens of such Arab nations, do have insight for more, liberal, more democratic ideas. We tell you because these people exist, your worst case scenario simply wouldn't happen. Sit down. And then we heard from them that constitutions are being written. Hence, we need some kind of neutral influence in these regions, in these democracies that are developing, because constitutions should never be attached to societies with religion. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, American Constitution was written under, in God we trust. We tell you, constitutions and laws are supposed to reflect the societies that are influencing, because that reflection is the reason why people follow the constitution and law to begin with. Hence, you detach religion completely from a society where religion is dominant. We tell you people have no reason to follow constitutions to begin with. But nonetheless, moreover, we tell you even if, under your model, religions do influence constitution, therefore, God forbid, if Arab nations do write a constitution that says women are animals, we tell you constitutions do change all the time. Not like all the time, like every day, but constitutions do change and reflective to the societies that they're, because, American constitutions never really specifically said slaves should never have rights, but that was adapted. The interpretations changed over time. Hence, don't worry, Arab nations would grant rights to women. And lastly, when law doesn't reflect the society, we tell you there are backlashes. That's where, closing opposition comes in, where we aggravate, where we show the aggravation of the situation. Why? Because, like it or not, we are dealing with societies where extremists and radicals do exist, right? We tell you there are portions of radicals. We tell you when the law simply completely negates them and completely set up a context where religion simply doesn't exist, we tell you there are bigger backlashes that are following. There are bigger fights. There are bigger legitimacy to these radicals to completely negate the law to begin with. We tell you that's not what we want. We don't want to detach and dismiss these radicals. Because they're part of society, we have to, in a way, create an environment where we persuade these people, don't dismiss, right? Engage to our case. So let's move on to more explanations of what we told you. Now, we told you, my first wonderful speaker clearly told you, Mr. Speaker, that we're dealing with a society where there are young liberals who want more democratic, who want more liberal ideas, liberal interpretations. We tell you, nonetheless, these liberals are still heavily Muslims. Most of them are still abiding by the Muslim ideas, Muslim values, because these people are grown up in an environment of Muslim surroundings, Muslim upbringing. Hence, and then we have the extreme, Methodists, radicals, who are heavily older generations like that. And then we have a lot of people in the middle who has no idea what to do, right? We tell you, democracy should be reflective of the society that they're dealing with. So the society that we're dealing with is a religious one. We tell you, bringing the idea of secularism, bringing the principles of democracy that were clearly set by the Western standards, doesn't really stand. For them to tell us what a democracy is in West does not really justify any analysis that are set by the opposing government, because that's simply not this context, simply not the stakeholders of this debate. We tell you, detaching democracy with ideas of religion, detaching democracy, parties, participation completely from the religion itself doesn't work. Why? Because you're dismissing the society itself that's against the principle of democracy. But moreover, we tell value, it lessens the participation of the people. Why? Because religion is the driving force of the everyday lives of the common Muslim people. Hence, by detaching democracy, you further isolate the trust that these people have in the newly growing forms of government that are emerging in these regions. That's simply not the case. Yes?
For the characteristic of a religion, religion itself is exclusive to only one group, which it never allows a room for other religions to...
Sit down. Sir, we are not talking about a case where there's a Christian party in the middle of the Arab region against a Muslim party in the middle of the Arab region. We're talking about the parties, or in a way politicians, with the differences, with an interpretation of the Quran text, within the difference of the degree of how they interpret the Quran text, or even the one with no religious color to begin with, or a different kind of like minority religion. Hence, we're telling you there are checks and balances that are existing because under the premise of the same Muslim God, you have different interpretations. That's the case that we're talking about, right? So let's move on to my second clash very briefly. My second clash, very briefly, is about the consequences. Now, we heard from both sides that religious values never change. We told you again, Mr. Speaker, that we're talking about interpretations rather than religion itself. We tell you there are organic changes that are happening, hence the interpretations are being democratized, are being widened. We tell you even under their model, if these people are still radicals, you have nothing being achieved because, number one, your policies have no legitimacy to begin with. People will still do radical things under your model. Hence, you fail to prove to us any kind of harms that justify your model. You fail to prove to us any kind of benefits, therefore, we take this debate home.
Give them another applause for that.